Welcome, Wargamers. Doug here from 2 Plus Stuff, and today we are continuing our discussion of the Old Dominion, the most recent faction to be announced for Conquest, the Last Argument of Kings. This is, like I said, part 2. Please go watch part 1 if you haven't already. We're going to need that to set up what's about to go down. And of course, I would just like to say, if you are interested at all in Conquest and the awesome community that Bellum has made around it, please consider using the affiliate link in my description down below. It'll save you a bunch of coin on an army and also go a long way to supporting me as a content producer. A massive, heartwarming thank you to all of the folks who already used it. It means the world to me. And so with that out of the way, let's pick up our story regarding Hazlia. Now, where we last left off in our discussion of the Old Dominion was that Hazlia was going insane. There was kind of a plateauing of progress as he was leading mankind, and then it started to fall apart. He wasn't big enough to satiate all the needs of humanity, and so we began looking for faith elsewhere. Even when Hazlia created this huge pantheon of gods, it just was never enough to satisfy his need for more and more worship, which of course is the source of his power. This all ultimately culminates in the two other deities of the triumvirate along with him, and most of humanity turning against their deity, Hazlia. Well, as you might expect, this takes an already, shall we say, unstable personality and magnifies it, because now he is absolutely thoroughly enraged by his own subjects, and he's already not doing good mentally. And so the plan is essentially twofold. One of the triumvirate is their job is to get humanity out and basically just to safety. The other is meant to go kill Hazlia. Now, we don't know anything really about the ritual or the sorceress rites that went down to kind of make this happen. All of those things have been kind of either lost to time or two rated as super heretical. I mean, obviously, if you can kill a god and it's for the longest time been the sole god of humanity, that's a big old deal. But regardless, the information is kept very secret. What we do know is that a couple hundred sorcerers got together and did a big collective spell all throughout the city of mankind, Capita, which is also Hazlia's throne, if you will, and are able to pull him down. During that time, he's thrashing, there's people getting killed by the hundreds as the deity creature is hurling buildings at people and raising up fire mounts. It's all falling apart at this point. Also, at the same time, there's a bunch of priests of Hazlia who are still faithful, and so they're worshiping and chanting to keep him around. So this really is a battle of the will for the future of mankind. Are we going to be enslaved to Hazlia, or do we have to strike out and start our own thing? And so while the deity is fighting the people trying to kill him, they're also fighting the other humans who want to keep him around. Now, this is where we're going to dip our toe back into sort of the mythic level of Conquest. We talk about the primordial gods and that kind of thing. So Hazlia started as a kind of small mote of creation, if you will, and is, for all intents and purposes, a deity level character that is immortal. However, it has been struck down in the deepest possible way. When its worship collapses, it's trying to kill the sorcerers doing the ritual, but it's also killing its own believers. Essentially, Hazlia breaks and decides he's going to pull all of his power into the city at once and just annihilate it. It's if I'm going down, I'm taking humanity with me. There are a lot of plot threads that kind of lead out from this event regarding the 100 Kingdoms, as those are the people who are fleeing the Old Dominion to get out of there because this giant nuke of energy is coming. The Last Legion making sure that they're able to get out of there, and they have a mythic kind of history all their own. But when Hazlia goes down, there's some element to his fall where he touches, interacts with, and mingles with the primordial god of death. He's not dead, he's immortal, but his immortality kind of mixes in with some of the death primordial god. And so you get this weird mix, and it's simply called unlife. Again, he cannot die, but he's been injected with the magic of death. And so all of a sudden, Hazlia is now the undead god of man. What seems to be the point of the ritual that was meant to take him out was the severing of his will and his power. That is to say, we can still have the power of a deity, but Hazlia won't be a person able to control it or wield it. We will be free of his will. His whims will no longer guide us. His mistakes will no longer, basically work against us. Well, Between all of these things happening at the same time and all the chaos that's going on, again, it is a little bit murky because there's not a lot of accounts of it and it's just kind of complicated and a lot of it's theory. Hazlia is able to project his power into all of the people who were and are faithful to him. He cannot, however, also project his will. So what I'm saying is, think of it in terms of like a necromancer, right? He can raise a zombie with his power, but if he doesn't have the will controlling it, it's just a zombie that meanders on its own, could even attack the guy who made it. In much of the same way, the power of Hazlia diffused to anyone who currently or previously worshipped him with all their might. This is entire legions of soldiers who were buried ceremoniously. They actually, as a kingdom, mimicked the Dweghome who came before, like their initial base, with, oh yeah, they bury their dead and do all these kinds of like mummifying rituals, so we should do the same. And so there's just huge tombs and vaults and catacombs full of soldiers that all get reanimated. Anyone who's currently alive is utterly like seduced by the power of Hazlia, somehow able to survive the carnage that is going down in the city. Well, now they're in this weird unlife kind of thing, but they have a bit more sentience than the soldiers who've been dead for a while, so that's how we start to see some of the leaders of this army being formed. And so with that, Hazlia falls, his, mega nuke of a power comes down on the city of Capita, making it a giant pit of black magic, essentially. Like think black flames roaring into the sky. It's this weird beam of light that just pierces up to the heavens. It's the grave of a god. Mankind, for the most part, has fled by now, because things have been falling apart for a little while. This was just the hatchet that killed him. And so this is where, the Old Dominion fell, but it didn't die. And that's kind of a huge theme that has been placed on this army. We're going to fast forward a bit. As you look over to the west, you have mankind reforming the 100 Kingdoms and their whole societal development. We talked about that quite a bit in the 100 Kingdoms lore videos. But over on the Old Dominion side, across the mountains from them, things got really dark because most of the landscape is destroyed. There's lots of just broken buildings, ash wastes, all these nasty things, undead or just meandering around. Turns out in that time that the religious priesthood that followed Hazlia has basically become its champions, able to direct the faithful, meaning the soldiers who died faithful to Hazlia, into war, essentially. And it has to rebuild itself. Like, this doesn't happen at the snap of a finger. The priests need to discover this power, figure out who's a survivor, who's not, kind of, reconquer some of the lands they lost, because if there wasn't a faithful or dead person standing in an area, technically they lost it. And so what happens is, while the 100 Kingdoms is forming and mankind is rebuilding over on the left, on the right you have the Old Dominion consolidating its power, figuring out, what do we do now? And this is essentially how we get the undead faction of Conquest, right? You have these motes of magic that are life-focused, but kind of tinged and poisoned with death elements to it, and so it's this unlife. Since anything that wasn't faithful to Hazlia kind of went away, either through death or through moving over to the 100 Kingdoms, it makes sense that the Old Dominion is now very much a remnant of its glory days, meaning the architecture and the structural designs and that kind of stuff that was passed down through Hazlia has maintained, so that's why they look visually distinct from mankind today. But also, they're reminiscent of the thing that kept them alive, which is the priesthood. They are very much a theological faction, more so than any other, I would say. Because Hazlia is a constant presence in their lives, because these are the priests and the servants of his cults, but he is shattered in a way that is kind of irreparable. Like, Hazlia himself is not walking at the top of these armies. And so this is where we get some elements of theological debate. And realistically, when I talk about the sub-factions for any army, what they really are is, here's what the general faction is like, and then here are 3 responses to it. So when we talk about the 3 that we have, that is the last legion. And so when we talk about the sub-factions for the Dominion, really what they are is just different plots and motivations and ways of responding to the fall. So we have the Final Creed, which is a very intense religious order. These are the ones who see Hazlia as sole deity, mankind should be purged because they're no longer the faithful, and we want to see Hazlia's vision of an undead utopia come to fruition. So that is a very religious force, right? That's servants of a forgotten god trying to enact his will. The next one is the Fallen Pantheon, and of course I'm going to do deeper dives into all these things later on, but I'm giving you the basics here. The Fallen Pantheon is all those little angels and like messenger deities and minor gods that Hazlia created. When he hits rock bottom and has death infused into him, it trickles down into all of those lesser beings that he created. So these are demigods, like true, much mightier than mankind beings that are just trying to figure out where do we go from here. They're bound to the will of this creature known as Hazlia. They have these undead teeming legions at their fore, but each and every one of them has that same hunger, that same desire to rebuild and regrow and strike out amongst the stars. Like all of them have that same faulty greed that drove Hazlia to where he ended up. And lastly are the legions, which is simply the undead masses. Some of these soldiers were great military heroes. A lot of them were just rank and file troops who died in battle and were given an honorable, funeral service kind of a deal. It turns out that towards the end of the Old Dominion, Hazlia became very, very interested in preservation of bodies. The idea was, priests would be like, oh, we'll mummify ourselves so that we can serve you in the afterlife kind of a deal. And he was really playing that up, but now that has been utterly and completely weaponized. So he has these colossal armies, tens of thousands of troops. Each one of these religious leaders that is now kind of what you would call a necromancer can raise a couple thousand at a go. And they've found over time that they're able to rebuild their bodies, essentially just like, if you lose an arm and there's just a random arm on the ground, you could pick it up, pop it in the joint, and you're good to go kind of a deal. And of course, there's a huge history of military leaders and how all that works together. And so with those three factions, you essentially kind of get what I'm going to call, the perfect trifecta of an Old Dominion, which is a focus on the religious nature, that is to say, the final creed, the deity structure, like they're intrinsically tied. This faction is, I would say, tied to the nature of gods in this setting, more so than any others. And that is represented by the Fallen Pantheon. And then there are just the teeming masses of armies that they created in service of both of those other factions, and that is the legions. That's how I would kind of surmise the three sub-factions for you. There's a lot of cool stuff to talk about when it comes to the actual characters for this faction. Not so much like the teeming hordes of regiments and that kind of thing, but you get a lot of character when it comes to the heroes that lead this army, like the Archimand, right? The Strategos and the Ziliarch, I believe is how it's pronounced. All these guys are super cool. But I'd like to end this video talking about why I think this faction is so interesting, right? Why is this cool? That's how I like to end every video. Well, there's a lot going on here. Obviously, the ability for mankind to kill their own god is just like, cue the heavy metal riff, right? That's just the coolest thing ever. But even after that, like, this event is the birthplace of the 100 Kingdoms, which is cool. I like when factions have such a deep history interlinking them because it makes them feel like they belong in part of the world. Aside from the incredible cool art that you've been seeing throughout these videos, there's not a ton of Old Dominion artwork, but I share what I can because I just think it's awesome. But also, here's an interesting thing. When Hazlia falls and all of his legions raise, right, that consolidation period after that, 100 Kingdoms is forming as we know it now. That whole time of silence that came from the Old Dominion, imagine if all of the military leaders from like ancient Rome to now just woke back up. Because then you would have to figure out what is warlike now, because technology has been advancing. So if these soldiers are like 300 years old, they could possibly have a very different understanding of warfare. So you're having this meeting of great minds, military tactics, and all these kinds of things that you now have to restructure and put them into a workable fighting force. Like, that's an incredibly interesting thing. Like, what if we could have some of the best generals, even of our modern era, just all in a room having to work together? It would probably drive them all insane, but it'd be really cool to watch how that comes together. And so to me, when I hear that, like, I get excited for this faction because even in this very confined space of like, this is a very specific part of the human history that got morphed by a very specific deity. Like, it might feel lore-wise like you're being boxed in, but the truth is, even when we look at truly, ancient empires that exist, like the Chinese Empire has been around for forever, there's very different approaches to militarism and campaigns and all these kinds of things throughout that history. So what happens if you have such an incredible diversity of minds that just suddenly, all of a sudden, click back on and they have to work together? So to me, that's like you have all the freedom you could ever want. Just say you're a general from a particular campaign where you had to learn these specific tactics. And honestly, it makes an abundant amount of sense. Also consider the fact that as the Old Dominion was growing, it kept absorbing all the other human factions it could, barring the Nords. So you can have people who appreciate Hazlia or the religious order in very different ways because they came from different traditions, different backgrounds. The Old Dominion, if you look at the map, is colossal in size and scope. So I think there is plenty of room for you to write whatever story you want, for sure. And I like to think that the Parabellum guys would like high five and back me up on that one. But I could easily see like religious sects from different regions, as well as military leaders from different regions and different times for both of those, being very different in terms of their core values and how they enact their faith or their plans. And of course, one thing you can't get over is just the absolutely stunning models. I mean, let's be honest, these guys are incredible looking. For an undead faction, I love the kind of Greek-like aesthetic they have going on, but also when you get into the Archimandrites and the leaders, they just have such a unique flair that is so cool. So friends, thank you so much for watching and listening. If you would like to see more Conquest content, I'm talking even like exploring the lore and maybe even looking over the sheet of like various characters or something like that, I'd be super happy to do that. Let me know in the comments down below. And quite frankly, vote with your dollar. If you use my affiliate link, it really does go a long way to letting me know that you want this kind of stuff. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful time wargaming with this awesome new faction from Parabellum. I'll catch you next time. Happy wargaming.